They found him 3 days after he killed the son. That's what the Kiowa said, that Silas Cord had shot daylight itself and buried it where no dawn could find it. The truth was darker. In the copper mines of Salvation Point, 37 men died when supports failed. Silas owned those mines, chose profit over safety, and when the widows came seeking justice, he burned their petition along with the only witness, a 14-year-old boy who'd seen the rotten timbers Silas refused to replace. Some debts can only be paid in blood that runs hotter than copper. These lands know pain better than joy. Every mark in the sand tells a story, but folks rarely listen. I saw this tale with my own eyes, like the crackle of a fire at night. The shadows of the past don't leave. You'd best listen close. Out here, it's the only way to survive. The cottonwood at Salvation Point's edge had claimed 19 necks before they brought Silas Cord to meet it. The tree stood ancient and gnarled, its branches spreading like skeletal fingers against a sky the color of old bruises. Ravens perched in those branches, waiting with the patience of creatures that understood the rhythms of frontier justice. They knew how men died here, swinging slow, boots scraping air, tongues black and swollen. Sheriff Tom Bridger checked the noose for the 3rd time, his weathered hands moving with practiced efficiency born from too many hangings. The rope was manila hemp, 1.5 inches thick, purchased special from Denver because Salvation Point believed in doing death correctly. 13 coils in the noose, positioned just so behind the left ear to snap the neck clean. Quick, merciful, if mercy could be measured in seconds of consciousness before the dark. Rope's good, Bridger muttered, though nobody asked. His voice carried the gravel of a man who'd swallowed too much desert dust and not enough truth. At 53, he'd become what the frontier made of lawmen who survived. Hard as creek stones, smooth from the constant flow of blood and violence, wearing away anything resembling sentiment. The crowd gathered thick as harvest wheat. 300 souls, maybe more, pressed shoulder to shoulder in the morning chill. Their breath rose in pale clouds, mingling with the smoke from pipes and hand-rolled cigarettes. These were mining folk, copper under their fingernails, exhaustion carved into the lines around their eyes. They'd come to see Silas Cord pay for the 37 who'd gone into the mountain and never emerged. Cord stood on a wagon bed, hands bound behind him with leather straps that bit deep enough to leave marks. He was 41 but looked older, his face a geography of indulgence and cruelty. Expensive suit from San Francisco, now torn and dusty from 3 days in Bridger's cells. Diamond stickpin still glinting at his throat. Bridger had let him keep it, figuring a man ought to meet his maker in his finery, even if that maker was just 18 feet of rope and gravity. Any last words? Bridger's question was ritual, expected, though he'd heard enough final statements to know they rarely mattered. Cord's eyes swept the crowd, lingering on faces he recognized. The widow Martinez, her black shawl pulled tight against grief and wind. Old man Chun, who'd lost 2 sons. The Harrigan twins, 14 years old, watching their father's killer with eyes too hard for children. Cord's lips pulled back in something that might have been a smile if smiles could carry contempt so pure it burned. "This town built itself on my copper," he said, voice steady despite the noose shadow falling across his face. "Every saloon, every church, every widow's pension came from my mines. You think killing me makes you righteous?" He spat, the glob landing near Bridger's boot. "You're all accomplices. Every coin you spent was baptized in those men's blood." The words hit like stones in still water, ripples spreading through the assembly. Truth had a way of cutting deeper than lies, and Cord's truth carried edges sharp enough to draw blood. They had spent his money, enjoyed prosperity built on risk he'd calculated and deaths he'd accepted as operational costs. Father Domingo pushed forward, his cassock dusty from the walk from St. Catherine's. "Mr. Cord, make peace with." "Peace?" Cord laughed, the sound harsh as crows calling. "I made my peace with hell long before this. I just wanted you all to know you'll be joining me eventually. Every single one of you who took my wages and asked no questions." Bridger nodded to Deputy Yates, who stood ready at the wagon's rear. Time to finish this. The crowd pressed closer, eager and afraid in equal measure. The ravens adjusted their perches, wings rustling like shuffled cards. That's when the rifle shot cracked across the morning. The sound came from the ridge east of town, echoing off the canyon walls until it seemed a dozen shooters had fired. The bullets struck true, not at Cord, but at the rope 6 inches above his head. Manila hemp exploded into flailing strands, the noose dropping useless around Cord's shoulders like a broken promise. Chaos erupted. Women screamed. Men dove for cover or drew weapons, spinning toward the ridge with revolvers that couldn't reach half that distance. Bridger shoved Cord down into the wagon bed, his own Winchester coming up smooth despite arthritic knuckles. His eyes scanned the ridge, finding nothing but rock and scrub pine, and whoever had just turned an execution into a rescue. Stay down. Bridger barked at the crowd, though half were already running, scattering like startled quail. Deputy Yates crouched behind the wagon wheel, his Navy Colt held in shaking hands. The boy was 22 and had never been shot at. His fear showed in every shallow breath. Another shot. This one kicked us 2 feet in front of Bridger's boots, a warning clear as spoken words. Back away from the prisoner. The sheriff's jaw tightened, veins standing out in his neck, but he was no fool. A marksman who could cut rope at 400 yards could put the next bullet through his eye just as easy. Everyone back. Bridger commanded, voice cutting through the panic. Clear the square. Now. The crowd needed no further encouragement. They fled towards storefronts and alleyways, leaving only the hardest or most foolish standing in the open. Cord remained in the wagon bed, face pressed against rough wood, but his shoulders shook with laughter. He'd been seconds from death, and now something impossible had intervened. From the ridge, a figure emerged. Distance and dust made details uncertain, but the silhouette was unmistakable. A man on horseback, rifle held casual across the saddle. He sat his mount like he had all the time in the world, like he hadn't just spat in the face of frontier justice and lived to tell it. Then he descended. The route down was treacherous, all loose shale and switchbacks that would cripple a careless horse. But this rider navigated it with the ease of someone who'd mapped every stone, practiced the path until muscle memory replaced thought. 5 minutes that felt like hours, the entire town watching, waiting to see what manner of man would risk his life for Silas Cord. He reached the square on a buckskin, gelding that looked like it could run for days without tiring. The rider himself was tall, lean as whipcord, dressed in worn trail clothes that had seen hard use. His face was hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat pulled low, and a bandana covered the lower half, leaving only his eyes visible, pale gray, like winter sky before snow. He stopped 30 feet from the wagon, rifle still held ready, but not quite aimed. The message was clear enough. I don't want trouble, but I'll end it if necessary. That man's been tried and convicted, Bridger called out, his Winchester trained on the stranger's chest. He killed 37 miners through negligence and murdered a boy to hide it. Law says he hangs. The stranger's voice came muffled through the bandana, but something in its timbre suggested youth. Late 20s, maybe 30. Your law, not mine. You want to die for Silas Cord? Bridger's finger rested on the trigger, pressure building, because that's what's about to happen. Nobody's dying today. The stranger's right hand shifted slightly on the rifle, not threatening, just adjusting. I'm taking Cord. You can try to stop me, but some of you will die trying. Maybe all of you. Maybe me too. That's a lot of blood for a man who's already as good as dead. What the hell does that mean? Deputy Yates called out, voice cracking. The stranger ignored him, eyes locked on Bridger. 2 men sizing each other up, calculating odds, measuring resolve against consequence. In those gray eyes, Bridger saw something familiar, the look of someone who'd already lost everything that mattered and found a dangerous freedom in that loss. I know who you are, the stranger said quietly, words meant for Bridger alone, but carrying in the tense silence. Tom Bridger, Medal of Valor at Antietam. Lost your son at Little Bighorn. Good man by most accounts. But you're about to hang the wrong person. That struck Bridger like a fist to the gut. What? The mine collapse wasn't negligence. The stranger's voice carried certainty, cold and absolute. It was murder. Deliberate. And Silas Cord isn't the murderer. He's just a fool who let himself be framed for it. Murmurs rippled through the remaining crowd. Widow Martinez crossed herself. Old Manchin shook his head, refusing to believe. The Harrigan twins stood frozen, caught between grief and confusion. "You're lying," Bridger spat. "We have evidence. We have testimony. You have what someone wanted you to find." The stranger guided his horse 3 steps closer, slow and deliberate. "Who brought you that evidence, Sheriff? Who testified that Cord ordered the supports left weak? Who made sure you found the boy's body before anyone else could see what really killed him?" Silence, thick and choking, because Bridger knew the answer, and that knowledge was poison spreading through his certainty. Deputy Marcus Flynn had brought the evidence. Flynn had found the boy. Flynn had been first on scene at the collapse. And Flynn, Bridger suddenly realized, was nowhere to be seen this morning. "Where's your deputy, Sheriff?" The stranger's question landed like a hammer on an anvil. "Where's the man who built this case against Cord? Why isn't he here to see justice done?" Bridger's hands tightened on the Winchester until his knuckles went white. Behind him, he heard Yates fumbling for something, probably the duty roster, trying to remember when Flynn last reported. The town square seemed to tilt, reality shifting beneath Bridger's feet, like he was standing on a ship's deck in heavy seas. "Last chance," the stranger said, not unkindly. "Let me take Cord. Let me prove what really happened. Or string him up and sleep forever wondering if you executed an innocent man." Innocent. The word didn't fit Silas Cord. The man had blood on his hands from a dozen smaller crimes, cruelties that never quite broke laws but shattered lives. But innocent of this? Of 37 deaths? That was a different question, and doubt was a crack in Bridger's armor that widened with each heartbeat. "If you're lying," Bridger said slowly, "I will hunt you to the ends of the earth." "Fair enough." The stranger lowered his rifle, sliding it into the saddle scabbard, a gesture of trust that could get him killed in the half-second it would take to draw again. "I'm riding south. If you want the truth, you'll find it in the mine. 3rd tunnel west face. Look for the lantern that was never lit." Then he was moving, spurring the buckskin toward the wagon. Bridger should have shot him. Every instinct screamed it. Every rule demanded it. But he stood frozen, weapon half raised, watching as the stranger cut Cord's bonds and hauled him onto the horse with practiced strength. "You're making a mistake," someone shouted from the crowd. Others took up the cry, anger replacing fear. Stones began to fly, clattering against wagon sides and storefront walls. The stranger wheeled the buckskin, Cord clutching at his back like a drowning man. "3rd tunnel, Sheriff," he called again. "The lantern that was never lit. If I'm wrong, you'll have your hanging. But if I'm right..." He didn't finish, just spurred hard, and the buckskin leaped into motion. They were gone in a storm of dust, hoofbeats fading into distance, while Salvation Point stood stunned, robbed of its vengeance and drowning in doubt. Bridger slowly lowered his rifle, mind already churning through implications like gears in a damaged clock, clicking, grinding, trying to make sense of what just happened. "Sheriff," Yates's voice was small, uncertain. "What do we do?" Bridger looked at the empty noose, swaying slightly in the morning breeze. Looked at the crowd, their faces confused and angry and frightened. Looked south toward the mountains where a stranger and Silas Cord were disappearing like ghosts into legends. "Give me a lantern," he said quietly, "and a dozen men who aren't afraid of the dark. We're going into the mine." The mine mouth gaped like a throat trying to swallow the mountain. Bridger stood before it with 11 men, each carrying lanterns that pushed weakly against the darkness. The timbers framing the entrance were scorched black from the explosion that had killed 37, some burned, some buried, all dead in ways that made identification possible only through personal effects and dental work. 3 months. That's how long ago the collapse happened. 3 months of grief soaking into Salvation Point's foundations like blood into floorboards. 3 months of widows waking to empty beds and children asking when Papa was coming home. 3 months for hatred of Silas Cord to ferment into something sharp enough to cut through any doubt. Until this morning. Until a stranger with a rifle and impossible claims had shattered certainty like a bottle against stone. "Third tunnel, west face," Bridger repeated, more to himself than the men with him. Deputy Yates stood at his right elbow, young face gone pale in the lantern glow. The others were volunteers, miners who'd survived because they were sick that day, or worked different shifts, or had quit the week before. Men who knew these passages, like sailors knew the sea. Old Lu Wei spat tobacco juice that sizzled on the ash-covered ground. "West face is where the cave-in started," he said in heavily accented English. He'd worked Cord's mines for 20 years, since the first shafts were sunk. Main support broke first. Then the walls came down like dominoes. "Show me," Bridger commanded, stepping forward into the mountain's maw. The descent was gradual, the main shaft sloping down at an angle gentle enough for mules to navigate. Rails ran along the floor where our carts once traveled, now twisted and buried beneath rockfall. The air grew colder, heavier, tasting of copper and old death. Some of the bodies had never been recovered, sealed behind tons of collapsed stone, entombed until geology itself forgot they'd existed. 30 minutes of walking through cramped passages, past abandoned equipment and cave-ins they'd stabilized enough to keep the mountain from swallowing the entire operation. The lanterns threw shadows that moved like living things, and Bridger found his hand drifting to his revolver more than once, expecting phantoms to step from the dark with accusations in their dead eyes. There, Lu Wei pointed ahead to where the tunnel split into 3 directions. The center passage was completely blocked, sealed by the collapse. The right tunnel showed damage but remained passable. The left, the west face, stood open but unwelcoming, timbers leaning at angles that suggested one good shake would bring everything down. "That's where it started?" Bridger asked. "Yes, main vertical support here." Lu Wei tapped a massive timber, 18 inches thick and running floor to ceiling. This one held the weight of everything above. When it broke, the tunnel pancaked in both directions. Killed everyone working this section. Some died fast from rockfall. Others, he trailed off, not needing to finish. Crushed or suffocated or buried alive, listening to their own screams echo back from stone. Bridger moved carefully into the west tunnel, boots crunching on gravel and shattered wood. His lantern revealed a scene of frozen chaos, or carts overturned, tools scattered, support timbers snapped like kindling. The walls bore scorch marks from the fire that had followed the collapse, when trapped methane ignited and turned the tunnel into a blast furnace. "The lantern that was never lit," Bridger muttered, scanning the wreckage. "What the hell does that mean?" "Sheriff," Yates's voice carried an odd note, somewhere between confusion and horror. He'd moved further into the tunnel, his lantern illuminating a section where the roof remained mostly intact. "I found something." Bridger picked his way through the debris, Lu Wei and 2 others following. Yates stood beside an alcove in the tunnel wall, a natural recess miners sometimes used to store equipment or take breaks away from the main passage. Inside the alcove sat a miner safety lantern, the old-style oil kind with wire mesh screens to prevent ignition of methane. The lantern was pristine, unblemished, not a scratch of damage despite being mere yards from where the tunnel had collapsed and burned. "That's not possible," Lu Wei breathed. "Everything here should be destroyed, buried or burned. But that lantern..." He reached out, then pulled back as if it might bite. "It looks brand new." Bridger crouched beside it, studying the lantern without touching. His years as a lawman had taught him that evidence told stories. You just had to learn the language. This lantern sat in an alcove that showed minimal blast damage. The walls around it were blackened, but not collapsed. The ground beneath was dusty, but not buried. "Someone put this here after the collapse," Bridger said slowly, "but before we searched the tunnel." "Why?" Yates asked. "What's special about a lantern?" Bridger lifted it carefully, examining it from all angles. Standard safety lamp, manufactured in Pennsylvania. common as dirt in mining operations across the West. Then he unscrewed the base where the oil reservoir sat, and something fell out with a metallic clink that echoed like a gunshot in the confined space. A dynamite cap, and used, pristine, sitting in a lantern that should never have contained anything except kerosene. "Sweet Christ," someone whispered. Bridger's hand trembled as he set the cap aside and peered into the lantern base. Inside, wrapped around where the wick should be, was a strip of paper. He teased it out carefully, unrolling it to reveal handwriting he recognized immediately. Vertical supports drilled 8-inch deep, packed with 60% nitroglycerin gel. Detonators wired to Gallery 7 switch. Collapse triggers in 3 minutes after activation. Make sure crew is at max capacity. Need high body count for insurance payout. MF. The handwriting was Marcus Flynn's. Deputy Flynn. The man who'd built the case against Cord. The man who'd found the boy's body. The man who was nowhere to be seen this morning. Mother of God, Lou said, reading over Bridger's shoulder. His face had gone ashen, eyes wide with the horror of understanding. He killed them. The deputy killed them all. Bridger's mind raced, pieces clicking into place with awful clarity. Flynn had joined the sheriff's office 8 months ago, coming from Denver with good references and better credentials. He'd been helpful, efficient, eager to prove himself. He'd volunteered for every shift, every investigation, every unpleasant duty that came with frontier law enforcement. And he'd been Silas Cord's mine foreman 2 years before that. The insurance, Bridger said, voice hollow. When the mine collapsed, who collected? The corporation, Lou Wei answered. Cord's company. $50,000 in payouts. Supposed to go to widows and families, but... He stopped, understanding washing over his weathered face. Flynn was on the board. Flynn handled the distribution. And skimmed half, Bridger finished. Maybe more. A collapse with high casualties triggers maximum payout. Bodies meant money, and Flynn made sure there were plenty of bodies. The tunnel seemed to close in, the weight of the mountain pressing down with accusation. 37 men murdered for profit. A 14-year-old boy who must have seen something, known something, killed to keep the secret. And Silas Cord, bastard, tyrant, cruel as winter, set up to hang for crimes he didn't commit. We were going to execute an innocent man, Yates whispered. The words scraped raw from his throat. No, Bridger corrected, and his voice carried the bitter weight of truth. We were going to execute a guilty man for the wrong crime. Cord's got blood on his hands from a dozen other sins. But these 37. He held up the note, the paper trembling in the lantern light. These are Flynn's. Where's Flynn? Lou Wei demanded. If he knows we're searching the mine. He's running, Bridger interrupted. Or he's already gone. He saw me hesitate this morning, saw the stranger take Cord, and he knew his time was up. But even as he said it, Bridger felt doubt nagging. Flynn was too careful, too methodical. A man who could orchestrate mass murder and frame someone else wouldn't just run. He'd have a plan, a fallback, something to ensure he came out clean no matter what evidence surfaced. Out, Bridger commanded, sudden urgency flooding his veins. Everyone out of the mine. Now. They didn't question him, just moved, stumbling back the way they'd come with lanterns swinging and casting wild shadows. Bridger brought up the rear, every instinct screaming danger, though he couldn't name what form it would take. They reached the main shaft just as the first explosion went off. The blast originated deep in the mine, somewhere in the eastern galleries where they hadn't searched. The ground bucked like a bronco, throwing men off their feet. Timbers groaned, dust cascaded from the ceiling, and a roar like God's own anger echoed from the depths. Move, Bridger screamed, grabbing Yates and hauling him toward the entrance. Behind them, the mountain was coming down. Support timbers snapped with sounds like rifle shots, and the ceiling began to collapse in a wave of stone and earth that chased them up the shaft. They burst into daylight as the mine mouth vomited dust and debris. Men scattered, diving behind or carts and equipment as the entrance partially collapsed, timbers splintering and falling in a tangled mass. The roar faded to rumbles, then to silence broken only by the clatter of falling rock. Bridger lay on his back, chest heaving, staring at the sky that had never looked so blue or precious. His ears rang from the blast, and his mouth tasted of copper dust, but he was alive. They all were, by some miracle. He wired it. Yates croaked, sitting up with blood trickling from a cut above his eye. Flynn wired the mine to collapse if anyone searched too deep. Had to, Bridger agreed, pushing himself upright. Couldn't risk us finding more evidence. Better to bury it all and us with it. The note, Lu Wei said urgently. The evidence, did you keep it? Bridger patted his coat pocket, relief flooding through him when he felt the crumpled paper and dynamite cap secured inside. Got it. Enough to bring Flynn up on charges of mass murder. If we can find him, Yates added darkly. Bridger climbed to his feet, legs shaking but holding. Around him, the volunteers were doing the same, checking themselves for injuries and marveling at their survival. But Bridger's mind was already moving ahead, tracking possibilities like a bloodhound on a scent. Flynn would run, yes, but where? South toward Mexico was obvious, but Flynn was smarter than obvious. North to Canada was possible, lawless territories where a man with money could disappear. East back to Denver made no sense. Too many people who might recognize him. West then. West into the deep mountains where mining camps and railroad towns offered anonymity and opportunity. A man could reinvent himself out there, especially with stolen insurance money to smooth the way. Mount up, Bridger commanded, his voice carrying the authority that made men jump to obey. We're going after Flynn, and we're getting Cord back. Cord, Yates asked, confused. Why do we want? Because we owe him, Bridger cut in sharply. We were about to hang him for Flynn's crimes. We owe him the truth, and we owe those 37 families justice that actually means something. He turned toward town, where horses waited and weapons could be gathered, but his eyes went south, toward the mountains where a stranger had disappeared with Silas Cord, carrying secrets and certainties that Bridger was only beginning to understand. Whoever that stranger was, he'd saved an innocent man this morning. Well, not innocent, never innocent, but undeserving of the noose for this particular crime. That was a debt Bridger intended to repay, even if it meant riding into hell to do it. Third tunnel west face, he muttered again, tasting the words like a bitter medicine that might cure or kill. The lantern that was never lit. The stranger had known, somehow impossibly. He'd known exactly where to find the evidence that would shatter Flynn's carefully constructed frame. That meant the stranger had been in the mine before, had searched it, had pieced together the truth, while Bridger and everyone else were blinded by grief and the need for someone to blame. Who was he? Why did he care? And how far ahead had he planned his rescue of Silas Cord? Questions for later. Right now, Bridger had a murderer to catch and a town to face with the news that they'd almost lynched the wrong man. The walk back to Salvation Point felt longer than the walk out. Every step weighted with shame and doubt. The town square still bore the marks of interrupted justice, the cottonwood standing empty, the wagon abandoned, the rope lying in coils like a serpent that had shed its skin. Bridger stood before the assembled crowd that gathered quickly once word spread, and he told them the truth. About the note, about Flynn, about the stranger's impossible knowledge that had saved them from compounding tragedy with injustice. Some believed immediately, relief and horror warring on their faces. Others resisted, clinging to their certainty because doubt was a quicksand that threatened to swallow everything they thought they knew. Widow Martinez wept into her shawl, mourning her husband anew, because now his death had no face to blame beyond an empty place where a deputy once stood. We ride in 1 hour, Bridger announced, his voice carrying across the square. I need every man who can sit a horse and shoot straight. We're going after Marcus Flynn, and we're bringing him back to face justice. And Cord, someone shouted. What about Silas Cord? Bridger met the questioner's eyes, held them until the man looked away. Cord comes back too, alive, to testify against Flynn and to answer for his own crimes, the ones he actually committed. But nobody touches him. Nobody. Not until we know everything. He turned away before more questions could come, heading for the sheriff's office to gather supplies and weapons. Behind him, the town buzzed with conversation, confusion, and the slow, painful process of trading one certainty for another. In his office, Bridger found a telegram waiting, delivered sometime during the chaos of the morning. He unfolded it with trembling fingers, reading words that made his blood run cold. Sheriff Bridger stopped Deputy Marcus Flynn, presumed heading your direction. Stop, wanted for embezzlement and murder in Denver. Stop, armed and dangerous. Stop. The telegram was dated 3 days ago, 3 days before the scheduled execution. Flynn had known his past was catching up, had known Bridger would eventually receive word. That's why he'd rushed the hanging, pushed for quick justice before questions could be asked. And it was why he'd rigged the mine to collapse, tying up loose ends with dynamite and deception, planning to disappear before anyone realized the truth. But the stranger had intervened. The stranger had stopped the hanging, forced the investigation, saved Bridger and his men from burial in a tomb of their own making. "Who are you?" Bridger whispered to the empty office, staring at that damn crumpled note with Flynn's handwriting that spelled out 37 murders in pragmatic, businesslike prose. Outside, horses were being saddled, and men were checking their weapons. The posse was forming, vengeance redirecting itself toward the proper target. But Bridger felt no satisfaction, only a cold determination that had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with debt. He owed that stranger, owed him for saving his soul from the stain of executing an innocent man, owed him for the truth, no matter how ugly. And he owed Silas Cord, bastard, tyrant, guilty of 100 sins, the chance to live long enough to pay for the crimes he'd actually committed rather than dying for someone else's. 1 hour. Bridger called to Yates, who was organizing supplies in the front room. "Then we ride south, and we don't stop until we find them all." The deputy nodded, young face set with determination. "Yes, sir. What about the town while we're gone?" "Father Domingo will keep order," Bridger decided. "And if he can't, the widows will. Hell hath no fury like a woman who's been robbed of even the cold comfort of proper vengeance." He buckled on his gun belt, checked the loads in his Winchester, and stepped out into the afternoon sun that painted Salvation Point in shades of gold and blood. The cottonwood shadow stretched across the square, empty noose swaying gently in a breeze that carried the smell of copper and ash. Somewhere south, a stranger rode with secrets. Somewhere closer, a murderer ran with blood on his hands and money in his saddlebags. And between them, Silas Cord, the man nobody wanted to save but everyone needed alive, held the key to justice that might actually mean something. Bridger mounted his bay gelding, the horse sensing his mood and dancing sideways. "Easy," he murmured, settling it with firm hands. "We've got miles to cover and a debt to pay. Time to ride." The posse formed up behind him, 11 men with hard eyes and harder resolve. They rode south as the sun climbed toward noon, leaving Salvation Point to wrestle with its conscience and the knowledge that justice was rarely simple and never clean. The stranger had bought them time. Now it was up to Bridger to make sure that time wasn't wasted. Flynn had a 3-hour head start, but he was riding west, not south as Bridger initially suspected. They found his trail by accident. One of the posse members, a Ute tracker named Two Ravens, spotted the distinctive mark of a horse favoring its left foreleg, prints that led away from Salvation Point like breadcrumbs scattered for the foolish. "Heading for Dead Man's Canyon," Two Ravens said, his scarred face impassive as he studied the tracks. "White men call it that because Apaches used to drive cattle thieves off the rim. Bodies pile up at the bottom, bones picked clean by coyotes in time." "Perfect place for Flynn," Bridger muttered. "Cut through the canyon, come out the other side in Bitter Creek territory. From there, he could reach half a dozen towns before we even knew which direction to search." They rode hard, pushing their mounts, but not breaking them. Flynn had hours on them, but he was alone, and a lone rider made mistakes that groups avoided. He'd leave more tracks, make noisier camps, exhaust his horse faster. Time and numbers were Bridger's allies. and he intended to use both ruthlessly. Noon passed, then mid-afternoon. The land rose around them, foothills giving way to proper mountains draped in pine and aspen. The air thinned, and the horse's breath came harder. Some of the posse members were flagging, and used a pursuit that demanded more than whiskey courage and righteous anger. Sheriff, 2 ravens had stopped again, dismounted to examine something in the trail. His expression hadn't changed, but his hand drifted toward the knife at his belt, a tell that made Bridger's spine stiffen. "What is it?" "Blood." 2 ravens pointed to dark spots on a flat rock. "Fresh, within the hour." And he moved forward, following a trail invisible to Bridger's eyes, and stopped beside a cluster of pines. More blood, lots more, and drag marks. Bridger dismounted, Winchester in hand, the rest of the posse spreading out with weapons drawn. The pines crowded close here, their shadows deep and cool despite the afternoon sun. The smell hit him before he saw the body. Copper and bowel, the signature scent of violent death. Marcus Flynn lay on his back beneath the trees, eyes open and staring at sky he could no longer see. His throat had been cut ear to ear, the wound gaping and terrible, exposing vertebrae and severed vessels. Blood had poured out in quantities that stained the pine needles black and drew flies in buzzing swarms. "Son of a bitch," Yates breathed, turning away to vomit against a tree trunk. Bridger crouched beside the corpse, forcing himself to examine details despite his stomach's revolt. Flynn had been dead maybe 45 minutes, the blood still tacky, the body not yet stiff. Killed quickly, efficiently, by someone who knew exactly where to cut. His saddlebags were gone, his weapons too, revolver and rifle both missing, along with whatever money he'd been carrying. But pinned to his chest with a knife was a piece of paper, the blade driven through his sternum with enough force to bite into the ground beneath. Bridger pulled the knife free, recognizing it as military issue, the kind cavalry soldiers carried, and unfolded the paper. More handwriting, but not Flynn's this time. Block letters, carefully printed. Sheriff Bridger, Flynn's confession attached. He killed 38, not 37. The boy wasn't the first. Ask Cord about Sarah Chun, age 16, missing 7 months ago. Flynn's money is buried under the lightning-struck pine at Marker 7 on the old wagon road. Use it for the families. Justice isn't always clean, but it's always necessary. The stranger. Attached to the note with a pin was another piece of paper, this one covered in Flynn's handwriting, shaky, terrified, written by a man who knew death was coming. I, Marcus Flynn, confessed to the murder of 37 miners at Salvation Point Copper Mine on March 15, 1887. I rigged the main support with dynamite to cause collapse. I killed Timothy O'Brien, age 14, when he discovered the evidence. I framed Silas Cord for my crimes. I did this for money, $47,000 from insurance fraud. I also killed Sarah Chun in September 1886 when she discovered my embezzlement. Her body is buried east of the mine, under the rock, shaped like a bear's head. I deserve death. Marcus Flynn. The confession was dated today, the ink still fresh enough to smudge. Bridger read it twice, 3 times, his hand shaking with rage and something close to awe. The stranger had tracked Flynn, caught him, extracted this confession, then executed him. Clean, efficient, final. He did our job for us. Lu Wei said quietly, reading over Bridger's shoulder. The stranger. He delivered justice. Murder, you mean? Yates corrected, his face pale but his voice steady. That's not justice. That's vigilante killing. Is it? Bridger asked, genuinely uncertain. Flynn was guilty of 38 murders. He would have hanged anyway, once we caught him. The stranger just expedited the process. Without trial, Yates insisted. Without due process. That's not law, Sheriff. That's revenge. Bridger looked at Flynn's corpse, at the confession that would bring closure to families who'd mourned in confusion and anger. Looked at the note about Sarah Chun, a name he recognized, a disappearance that had haunted him for months before the mine collapse stole all his attention. Maybe, he admitted, maybe it is revenge, but it's also truth. and sometimes truth matters more than process. The words tasted bitter, at odds with everything Bridger had believed about law and order and civilization's thin veneer over barbarism. But he'd nearly executed an innocent man this morning, had stood with noose in hand ready to deliver justice that would have been the worst injustice imaginable. The stranger had saved him from that, had stopped the hanging, pointed them toward evidence, and now delivered both confession and consequence. It wasn't clean, but it was complete. "Bury him," Bridger ordered, gesturing to Flynn's body. "Mark the grave. When we get back, I'll arrange for proper burial with a headstone that lists his crimes. Everyone should know what he did and why he died for it." The posse set to work with shovels they'd brought for this purpose, though none of them had expected to dig Flynn's grave this soon. While they worked, Bridger studied the confession again, his detective's mind picking apart details. Flynn had been terrified when he wrote this. The handwriting degraded from his usual precise script into something jagged and rushed. The stranger must have given him a choice: write the truth or die slowly. Flynn chose truth, probably hoping for mercy that never came. "Sarah Chun," Lu Wei said softly, appearing at Bridger's elbow. "That was Old Man Chen's granddaughter. She went missing last September. We searched for weeks, found nothing. Flynn killed her." Bridger's voice was flat, emotionless, because feeling anything right now would break him. "Killed her and buried her and let everyone believe she'd run away to Denver or been taken by raiders. And we believed it because it was easier than looking too hard at one of our own. We'll find her body," Lu Wei promised. "Give her family closure." Closure. Bridger tested the word, found it wanting. Is that what this is? Flynn's dead. The truth is out. But does that heal anything? Do those widows sleep better knowing their husbands died for insurance money instead of negligence? Does Old Man Chen get his granddaughter back? Lu Wei had no answer, just stood silent beside him while the posse finished their grim work. Flynn's grave was shallow, unmarked except for a cairn of rocks. They'd dig him up eventually, give him a proper burial with a proper headstone. But for now this was enough. "Mount up," Bridger called. "We still need to find Cord and the stranger." "Why?" Yates asked, the question everyone was thinking. "Flynn's dead. The confession exonerates Cord. We could just go home." "Because I owe them," Bridger said simply. "The stranger saved an innocent man and delivered justice when our system failed. Cord was about to die for crimes he didn't commit. I need to look them both in the eye and acknowledge that debt." They rode south again, following tracks that two ravens found with uncanny skill. The sun dipped toward the western horizon, painting the mountains in shades of copper and gold. Beautiful country, Bridger thought distantly. The kind of land that killed you if you disrespected it, but rewarded those who learned its harsh lessons. An hour before sunset, they found them. The camp was in a small clearing beside a mountain stream, sheltered by massive pines that had probably been old when the first white men crossed these mountains. The stranger sat by a fire, cooking something that smelled like rabbit. His horse grazed nearby, the buckskin gelding that had carried him and Cord away from Salvation Point. And Silas Cord sat across the fire, wrists and ankles bound, his expensive suit torn and filthy. He looked up as the posse emerged from the trees, his face a mask of emotions too complex to name. Relief, fear, anger, and something that might have been shame. The stranger didn't move, didn't reach for the rifle leaning against a nearby rock. He just watched Bridger dismount and approach, those pale gray eyes calm as winter lakes. "Sheriff," the stranger said, his voice still muffled by the bandana. "I see you found Flynn." "Found him dead," Bridger corrected, "with your knife in his chest and his confession pinned beneath it." "Did the confession satisfy your questions?" "It did." Bridger stopped 10 feet from the fire, close enough to talk, but far enough to draw if needed. 38 murders, insurance fraud, the Chin girl, all laid out neat as a church sermon. Then justice has been served. The stranger turned the rabbit on its spit, grease hissing into the flames. "Cord here can go free. The families can have closure, and Salvation Point can move on." After you murdered Flynn in cold blood, Yates interjected, stepping forward with his hand on his revolver. That's not justice. That's execution without trial. The stranger's eyes flicked to Yates, assessed him in a heartbeat, then dismissed him. Deputy, Flynn killed 38 people for money. He was about to kill 11 more when he rigged that mine to collapse. He would have escaped justice if I hadn't stopped him. Tell me, would you prefer he'd gotten away? I'd prefer he faced a judge and jury. Yates shot back. What? The stranger's voice carried genuine curiosity. So he could hire expensive lawyers and delay for years while family suffered? So he could exploit legal technicalities and maybe escape the noose? Your system failed, Deputy. It was about to hang an innocent man and let the guilty one run free. I simply corrected the error. Who are you? Bridger asked, the question that had haunted him all day. How did you know about the mine? About Flynn? About the evidence we'd need? The stranger was silent for a long moment, firelight playing across what little of his face was visible. Then, slowly, he reached up and pulled down the bandana. The face beneath was younger than Bridger expected, maybe 28, with the kind of features that would be handsome if they weren't carved into lines of hard living and harder purpose. A scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, pale against sun-bronzed skin, but it was his eyes that struck Bridger. Those winter-gray eyes that had seen too much death and decided to become its instrument. My name is Thomas O'Brien, the stranger said quietly. Timothy O'Brien, the boy Flynn killed to cover his crimes, was my little brother. The confession hung in the air like gun smoke. Bridger felt the pieces clicking into place, the intimate knowledge of the mine, the careful planning, the ruthless efficiency. This wasn't about justice in the abstract. This was personal, blood-deep, the kind of vengeance that carved itself into a man's bones and wouldn't rest until satisfied. I'm sorry for your loss, Bridger said, and meant it, but that doesn't justify murder. Doesn't it? Thomas asked, his voice soft but edged like a blade. Flynn killed my brother to hide his crimes. Killed 37 miners for profit. Killed Sarah Chun to cover his tracks. How many deaths would justify his execution, Sheriff? How many families destroyed before it becomes acceptable to put him down like the mad dog he was? The law, Yates began. The law was about to hang Silas Cord for Flynn's crimes. Thomas interrupted, his voice rising for the first time. The law failed my brother, failed Sarah Chun, failed every single person Flynn murdered. Don't lecture me about legality when your justice was 3 feet of rope and a broken neck for the wrong man. Silence fell, broken only by the crackle of fire and the distant call of an eagle. Bridger looked at Thomas O'Brien, at the grief and rage barely contained beneath that scarred exterior, and saw himself 20 years ago when his own son died at Little Bighorn. He'd wanted revenge then, had dreamed of tracking down every warrior who'd fought in that battle and making them pay in blood. But the army had stopped him, regulations and duty had bound him, and eventually time had worn down the sharpest edges of his grief into something bare. He'd wanted revenge then, had dreamed of tracking down every warrior who'd fought in that battle and making them pay in blood. But the army had stopped him, regulations and duty had bound him, and eventually time had worn down the sharpest edges of his grief into something bearable. Thomas O'Brien hadn't waited for time's mercy. He'd taken action, delivered justice with his own hands, and now sat before them without apology or regret. What do you want me to do? Bridger asked quietly. Arrest you? Hang you for killing a man who deserved killing? Thomas shrugged, the gesture carrying a weariness that spoke of sleepless nights and roads walked alone. I expected you might try. I won't resist. I did what needed doing, and I'll face whatever consequences come. No, the word came from Silas Cord, surprising everyone. The mining magnate had been silent throughout, but now he struggled to his feet despite bound ankles. You're not arresting him, Sheriff. This man saved my life. Stopped the lynching. Delivered justice your system couldn't provide. Cord, Bridger began. I'm a bastard. Cord interrupted, his voice carrying across the clearing. I know what I am. I've exploited workers, cut corners, made fortunes off other men's suffering. I deserve punishment for those crimes. But Flynn's murders? Those weren't mine, and I was about to hang for them because your town needed someone to blame. He turned to Thomas, meeting those winter-gray eyes without flinching. You saved an innocent man. Not a good man, but an innocent one. That counts for something. Bridger stood silent, weighing justice against law, vengeance against order. His badge felt heavy on his chest, a physical reminder of oaths taken and duties sworn. But his conscience felt heavier, burdened by the knowledge that Thomas O'Brien had done what the law couldn't or wouldn't do. The confession stands, Bridger said finally, his decision made. Flynn killed 38 people. He died for it. How he died, that's between him and God. He met Thomas's eyes. You're free to go. But if I ever see you in Salvation Point again, I'll have to arrest you. Understand? Thomas nodded slowly, something like gratitude flickering across his scarred face. I understand, Sheriff. And for what it's worth, I'm sorry it came to this. But my brother deserved justice, and your law wasn't going to deliver it. I know, Bridger admitted, the words bitter but necessary, and that failure is on me. He turned to his posse, reading the mixture of relief and confusion on their faces. They'd ridden out expecting a straightforward arrest, and found instead a moral quagmire where right and wrong tangled like thorns. We're riding back, Bridger announced. Cord comes with us. He'll stand trial for his actual crimes, the safety violations, the exploitation, the dozen smaller cruelties that don't deserve hanging but do deserve consequences. O'Brien stays here. He glanced at Thomas. Give us an hour's head start before you break camp. Thomas inclined his head in agreement, already moving to untie Cord's bonds. As he worked, he spoke quietly enough that only Bridger could hear. Sarah Chen's body is where Flint said. Give her grandfather closure. And the money, it's exactly where I told you. Use it for the families. All of it. You're not taking any? Bridger asked, surprised. Blood money buys nothing but nightmares, Thomas replied. I've got enough of those already. Cord, now freed, rubbed circulation back into his wrists and moved toward the posse's horses without protest. He looked older somehow, diminished, as if the near-death experience had burned away some of the arrogance that had defined him. As Bridger mounted his bay, he took one last look at Thomas O'Brien, sitting by the fire, a man who delivered justice and damned himself in the process. Their eyes met across the clearing, and something passed between them. Understanding, perhaps, or acknowledgement that some choices left scars no time would heal. Let's go home, Bridger said quietly, turning his horse north. They rode in silence as darkness gathered, carrying with them a confession, a corpse's location, and the knowledge that justice wasn't always found in courtrooms and nooses. Sometimes it came from strangers with winter eyes and ruthless purpose, delivering verdicts written in blood beneath mountain pines. Behind them, Thomas O'Brien stayed by his fire until the hoofbeats faded. Then he stood, kicked dirt over the flames, and mounted his buckskin. He had money to bury, a grave to mark, and a promise to keep to a 14-year-old boy whose death had started everything. The mountains swallowed him like they'd swallowed so many before, another ghost among countless others who'd found in the wilderness either redemption or damnation, and sometimes both at once. Salvation Point looked different when Bridger rode back, and 3 days later. Or perhaps Bridger was different, and the town merely reflected his changed perspective. Either way, the place felt smaller, more fragile, as if the foundation on which it stood had revealed itself to be sandstone rather than granite, solid-looking but easily eroded by truth's relentless water. The posse had dispersed upon reaching town, each man heading home to family or bottle or whatever comfort they sought after days in the saddle chasing ghosts and justice. Only Bridger, Yates, and Silas Cord rode directly to the sheriff's office, arriving as sunset painted the buildings in shades of amber and rust. A crowd gathered immediately, drawn by news that traveled faster than horses in towns this size. They pressed close, faces hungry for answers, hands reaching toward Cord with intentions that ranged from violence to validation. Back off, Bridger commanded, his voice carrying the authority that made people hesitate. "Cord's in my custody. Anyone who touches him answers to me. He killed our husbands." Widow Martinez pushed forward, her face twisted with grief that had found no outlet for 3 months. "He deserves." "Flynn killed your husbands," Bridger interrupted, his words dropping like stones into still water. "Marcus Flynn rigged the mine to collapse. Murdered 37 miners for insurance money. Murdered Sarah Chun when she discovered his embezzlement. Murdered Timothy O'Brien when the boy found evidence." Silence fell, thick and suffocating. The crowd stood frozen, mind struggling to reprocess 3 months of certainty into new configurations that hurt worse than the original grief. "Flynn," someone whispered. "Deputy Flynn?" "The same." Bridger dismounted, pulling Flynn's confession from his saddlebag. He wrote this before he died. Every detail of how he planned it, executed it, framed Cord for it. The evidence is in the mine, the lantern, the dynamite caps, the rigged supports. It's all there for anyone who wants to verify. "Where's Flynn now?" Old man Chin demanded, his weathered face carved from pain. "Where's the man who killed my granddaughter?" "Dead," Bridger said flatly. "Executed 3 days ago in the mountains. His body's buried at Dead Man's Canyon, marked with a cairn. When winter passes, we'll dig him up and give him a proper burial with the headstone listing his crimes." "Who killed him?" Martinez asked, her voice hollow. Bridger hesitated, weighing truth against expedience. "Justice killed him," he said finally. "The kind that doesn't wait for courts and lawyers and technicalities. He confessed everything, and he paid the price." He held up the confession, letting the crowd see Flynn's handwriting, the shaky letters that spelled out damnation in pragmatic detail. "This is the truth. All of it. Flynn killed 38 people. Silas Cord is guilty of many things: safety violations, worker exploitation, cruel business practices. But he didn't kill your families. Flynn did." The crowd's anger began to shift, redirecting itself toward a target who wasn't present to receive it. Frustration rippled through them, the need for vengeance finding no outlet because the guilty party was already dead and buried in an unmarked grave. "What happens to Cord?" Chin asked, his eyes boring into the mining magnate who stood silent beside Bridger's horse. "He stands trial," Bridger answered, "for his real crimes. The safety violations that led to other deaths, the exploitation of workers, the dozen smaller cruelties that don't deserve hanging but do deserve punishment. But not for Flynn's murders. Those died with Flynn." Cord finally spoke, his voice carrying across the square with surprising steadiness. "I won't run. I won't hide behind lawyers or money. I'll face trial for what I actually did, and I'll accept whatever punishment the law demands." He paused, looking at the faces surrounding him, faces that had hated him for months, had cheered his scheduled execution, had wanted him dead with the fervor that bordered on religious. "I know I can't give you back what you lost, but I can tell you the truth. I didn't kill them. Flynn did. And knowing that won't heal your grief, but maybe it'll let you direct your anger at the right person." "The right person is dead," Martinez said bitterly. "What good does anger do against a corpse?" "None," Cord admitted, "but neither does hanging an innocent man. Sheriff Bridger saved you from that. Saved you from compounding tragedy with injustice." The acknowledgement seemed to deflate him, the last of his arrogance leaking away like air from a punctured bladder. He suddenly looked old, tired, diminished to something almost human. Bridger gestured toward the office. "Inside, Cord. Cell 3. You'll be comfortable enough until the circuit judge arrives." Cord went without resistance, his expensive boots dragging slightly as he climbed the steps. The crowd watched him go, their emotions too complex for simple expression. Relief, anger, confusion, and the hollow ache of grief that had lost its target. As Bridger secured Cord in the cell, Yates hovered near the door, young face troubled. "Sheriff, what really happened to Flynn? Who executed him?" Bridger locked the cell, testing the bars out of habit. "Does it matter?" "It does if we're lawmen," Yates insisted. "Murder is murder, even if the victim deserved it. Thomas O'Brien, Bridger said quietly, keeping his voice low enough that Cord couldn't hear. Timothy O'Brien's older brother. He tracked Flynn, extracted the confession, then killed him. Clean cut across the throat. Professional. Final. And you let him go. Yates said, not quite accusatory, but close. I did. Bridger met the young deputy's eyes, seeing his own younger self reflected there. Idealistic, certain, believing that law and justice were synonymous. Because sometimes the right thing isn't the legal thing. Because Flynn would have escaped or lawyered his way out of consequences. Because 38 families deserve closure, and O'Brien delivered it when our system couldn't. That's not how law works. I know how law works. Bridger's voice rose, frustration and exhaustion finally breaking through. I've worn this badge for 30 years. I've arrested murderers and hanged them legally. I've watched guilty men go free on technicalities and innocent men die because evidence was circumstantial. I know every failure of our system, every crack where justice slips through. He took a breath, forcing calm. Thomas O'Brien killed a mass murderer who was running free. He extracted a confession that brings closure to dozens of families. He pointed us towards Sarah Chen's body so her grandfather can bury her properly. Tell me, deputy, what part of that deserves punishment? Yates stood silent, wrestling with principles that suddenly seemed less solid than they had a week ago. The law. The law was about to hang Silas Cord for crimes he didn't commit. Bridger interrupted. The law failed Sarah Chen, failed the O'Brien boy, failed 37 minors who died for insurance money. So yes, I let Thomas O'Brien walk free. And I'll do it again if the same situation arises. He turned away, ending the conversation, and moved to his desk where paperwork awaited. Flynn's confession needed to be filed officially. Sarah Chen's grave needed to be located. The insurance money needed to be recovered and distributed. Justice might be messy, but its aftermath required meticulous documentation. Over the next week, the town slowly absorbed the truth. Father Domingo held a special mass for the 38 victims, naming them individually and acknowledging that their deaths had been murder, not accident. The service drew every resident of Salvation Point, packing St. Catherine's until people stood in the aisles and spilled out onto the steps. Bridger attended, standing at the back, watching the community grieve anew for losses that had just been recontextualized. Widow Martinez wept into her daughter's shoulder. Old man Chen sat stone-faced, his weathered hands clasped so tight the knuckles went white. The Harrigan twins, now orphans twice over, first losing their father, then losing the certainty that his death meant something, stared at the altar with eyes too old for 14. After the service, Bridger organized a party to search for Sarah Chen's body. 2 ravens led them east of the mine, following Flynn's confession to the rock shaped like a bear's head. They found her shallow grave in an afternoon, bones wrapped in rotting cloth, a silver locket still around her neck with a photograph of her family inside. Chen didn't speak when they brought her remains back, just held the small wooden box containing her bones and wept silently, tears cutting tracks through dust on his weathered face. His wife keened, a sound that carried across Salvation Point like wine through a canyon, and everyone who heard it felt something break inside themselves. The burial was private, family only, but the whole town observed a moment of silence at noon, businesses closing, mining operations halting, everyone standing still for 60 seconds to acknowledge a girl whose death had been hidden for 7 months by a man they trusted. The insurance money was harder to recover. Flynn had buried it as Thomas O'Brien said, under the lightning-struck pine at Marker 7 on the old wagon road. $47,000 in bills and coins, packed in waterproof cases and hidden beneath 3 feet of earth. Bridger stood over the excavated money, watching sunlight glint off gold eagles and silver certificates, and felt nothing but disgust. This was what 38 lives had been worth to Marcus Flynn. This pile of metal and paper was the price he'd calculated as acceptable for mass murder. Distributed evenly, Bridger ordered the town council. Every family that lost someone gets an equal share. No arguments, no exceptions. What about Cord's trial? Councilman Hartwell asked. If he's found guilty of other crimes, shouldn't that money go toward restitution? No, Bridger said flatly. This is Flynn's money, stolen from Flynn's victims. It goes to the families, not into Cord's legal settlement. The distribution took 2 days. Each family called individually to the bank, where discrete payments were made. Some wept. Some accepted silently. Some tried to refuse, saying no amount of money could replace what they'd lost. But Bridger insisted. The money wouldn't heal grief, but it would feed children, pay mortgages, provide security in an uncertain world. Through it all, Silas Cord remained in his cell, reading books that Father Domingo brought him and answering Bridger's questions about mine operations and safety violations. He was cooperative, almost helpful, as if the near-death experience had cracked something open inside him and let out the human being that greed and ambition had buried. I knew the supports were marginal, Cord admitted during one interview, his voice hollow. I'd been told they needed replacement, but replacement meant shutting down operations for weeks, losing revenue, admitting fault. So I prioritized profit over safety. And men died, Bridger said. Different men, Cord corrected quietly. Men who died in other accidents, other collapses that weren't as dramatic. I'm guilty of those deaths, Sheriff. Guilty of prioritizing copper over human life. But Flynn's 37. He shook his head. Those weren't mine. Those were murder, pure and calculated. The judge will sort it out, Bridger said, rising to leave. Will he? Cord's question stopped him at the cell door. Or will he see a monster and decide I'm guilty of everything, including crimes I didn't commit? Because that's what mobs do, Sheriff. And courts are just mobs with better grammar. Bridger had no answer to that, just left Cord in his cell and returned to the endless paperwork that law enforcement demanded. Reports needed filing, evidence needed cataloging, official statements needed recording. The bureaucracy of justice ground slowly, but it did grind. 3 weeks after Flynn's death, the circuit judge arrived, a gray-haired man named Elijah Stone who'd been dispensing frontier justice for 20 years. He reviewed the evidence with meticulous care, interviewed witnesses, read Flynn's confession with expressionless features that revealed nothing. The trial lasted 4 days. Cord stood accused not of murder, but of criminal negligence in previous mining deaths. 7 men who died in accidents over the past 3 years that investigations revealed were preventable with proper safety measures. The verdict was guilty on 3 counts. The sentence was 5 years in territorial prison and financial restitution to the families of victims. Cord accepted it without appeal, his face calm as Judge Stone read the decision. Mr. Cord, the judge said, setting aside his papers, you're not a good man, but you're not the Devil's Salvation Point made you into. You'll serve your sentence, pay your debts, and hopefully emerge with a better understanding of human value. Do you have anything to say? Cord stood, his expensive suit replaced by prison grays. Just that Sheriff Bridger saved more than my life. He saved this town from becoming murderers. Remember that when you think about justice. They took him away in chains, loading him onto the prison wagon for the long journey to territorial lockup. Bridger watched him go, feeling neither satisfaction nor regret, just the hollow exhaustion of someone who'd fought a battle without clear victory. Winter came early to Salvation Point that year, snow falling in October and staying through November like a guest who'd forgotten how to leave. The mountains disappeared behind white curtains, and the town hunkered down for the long cold months when mining operations slowed and men found other ways to occupy time that didn't involve freezing in dark tunnels. Bridger spent those months writing reports that would never be read and wrestling with questions that had no easy answers. Thomas O'Brien's execution of Flynn was technically murder, but prosecuting it felt like punishing someone for doing the job the law had failed to accomplish. The contradiction kept him awake nights, pacing his small house while wind rattled the windows and snow piled against the walls. Sarah Chen's death haunted him. 7 months she'd been missing. 7 months he'd searched half-heartedly, accepting the easy explanation that she'd run away rather than digging deeper into Deputy Flynn's convenient alibis. If he'd been more thorough, more suspicious, maybe she'd still be alive. Maybe the mine collapse would never have happened. The weight of those failures pressed down like the snow outside. Heavy, cold, suffocating. You couldn't have known, Father Domingo said during one of Bridger's visits to St. Catherine's. The priest had become an unexpected confidant, someone who understood the burden of other people's sins and the cost of witnessing too much human darkness. I should have known, Bridger countered, sitting in the empty church, his voice echoing off stone walls. Flynn was my deputy, working beside me every day. I should have seen something, some sign that he was capable of mass murder. Evil hides well, Domingo replied, his accent softening the harsh words. Especially intelligent evil. Flynn was careful, methodical. He showed you exactly what you wanted to see. And 38 people died because I believed him. No, Domingo's voice carried surprising firmness. 38 people died because Flynn killed them. You didn't rig the dynamite, didn't cut Sarachen's throat, didn't murder a 14-year-old boy. Flynn did those things. Your sin, if you must claim one, is being human, imperfect, fallible, unable to read minds or predict the future. Bridger wanted to accept that absolution, but it felt unearned. Thomas O'Brien read Flynn correctly. Tracked him, caught him, delivered justice. All things I should have done. O'Brien had advantages you lacked, Domingo pointed out. Personal motivation, freedom from legal constraints, the willingness to kill in cold blood. Are those advantages you wish you possessed? Put that way, the answer was obvious. Bridger had worn a badge for 30 years precisely because he believed in law over violence, process over vengeance. Becoming like Thomas O'Brien, efficient, ruthless, willing to execute without trial, would mean surrendering everything that made the badge meaningful. I don't know what I believe anymore, Bridger admitted quietly. The law almost killed an innocent man. A vigilante delivered justice the law couldn't. Every principle I've held seems negotiable now. Conditional. Domingo leaned forward, his dark eyes catching lantern light. Sheriff, you're experiencing what we call a crisis of faith. The world revealed itself to be more complex than your principles allowed, and now you're questioning whether those principles have any value. But consider this. Without your principles, Silas Cord would have hanged. Without your willingness to question, to search the mind, to believe Thomas O'Brien's warning, an innocent man would be dead and Flynn would have escaped. Cord's not innocent. Innocent of those particular crimes, Domingo corrected, which is what matters. Your principles, your belief in evidence and truth, in getting it right, saved his life. The system worked, Sheriff, because you made it work. Bridger sat silent, turning the priest's words over in his mind like stones in a river, feeling their smooth logic, but unable to fully accept their comfort. The crisis of faith Domingo named wasn't about God or religion. It was about law and order and whether those concepts meant anything when pushed against the chaos of human evil. Outside, snow continued falling, burying everything in white silence. Inside, the church's warmth felt fragile, a small bubble of comfort in a world that had revealed itself to be colder and crueler than Bridger had let himself acknowledge. What happened to O'Brien? He asked suddenly. The brother. Do you think he found peace? Domingo considered the question carefully. I think he found justice. Whether that's the same as peace, only he can answer. But men who kill, even justifiably, carry those deaths with them. Thomas O'Brien executed Flynn, and that act is now part of his soul, a stain that won't wash away, even if it was the right thing to do. You think it was right? I think it was necessary, Domingo said, choosing his words with pastoral care. Right and wrong become complicated when systems fail. Flynn would have escaped legal justice, too connected, too wealthy, too careful. O'Brien delivered a different kind of justice, the frontier kind that built this territory before law arrived. Was it right? He shrugged. Was it necessary? Absolutely. They sat together in comfortable silence, two men wrestling with questions that had troubled humanity since the first laws were written and the first exceptions were made. Eventually Bridger rose, nodded his thanks, and left the church to walk back through snow-covered streets toward his empty house. The town was quiet in the evening, smoke rising from chimneys, lamplight glowing in windows, families gathered around tables for dinner and conversation. Normal life continuing despite tragedy, because that was what humans did, absorbed grief, adapted to new realities, moved forward because the alternative was giving up entirely. At the widow Martinez's house, children played in the snow, their laughter carrying through the cold air. She'd used Flynn's blood money to buy winter coats and boots for them, to stock her pantry with food that would last until spring. The money wouldn't replace their father, but it gave them survival, and survival was its own kind of justice. Old Man Chun had used his share differently, commissioning a memorial stone for Sarah, white marble carved with her name and dates and a simple inscription, "Beloved granddaughter, stolen too soon, now home." The stone stood in the cemetery on the hill, visible from town, a permanent reminder that some debts could never be repaid. Bridger paused at the cemetery entrance, looking up at the stones silhouetted against snow and twilight. 38 new graves, each marked with names and the truth. Murdered by Marcus Flynn, March 15th, 1887. The town council had insisted on the inscription, wanting future generations to know these weren't accidents or negligence, but deliberate killings. And beside those graves, separated by a careful distance, was Flynn's marker, a simple wooden cross with his name and a different truth. Marcus Flynn, deputy and murderer, justice delivered. No death date, no rest in peace. Just the facts, stark and unadorned, a warning to anyone who thought law enforcement made them untouchable. Bridger climbed the hill, his boots crunching through fresh snow, and stood among the graves. In the fading light, he could barely read the inscriptions, but he'd memorized them all. Every name, every age, every family left behind. "I'm sorry," he said to the silence, his breath fogging in the cold air. "I failed you. All of you. I should have seen Flynn for what he was. Should have protected you." No answer came, just wind whistling through the cemetery stones and the distant call of an owl hunting in the gathering darkness. But Bridger felt something shift inside himself, not forgiveness exactly, but acceptance. He'd failed, yes, but he'd also corrected that failure as best he could. He'd stopped an innocent man's execution, tracked down the truth, ensured families received compensation and closure. It wasn't redemption, but it was something. A step away from the precipice of total failure, a handhold that kept him from falling into the darkness that had swallowed Marcus Flynn. He descended the hill as full darkness fell, navigating by memory and the distant glow of town lights. His house waited, cold, empty, but his. Inside, he built a fire, made coffee, and continued the endless work of being sheriff in a town that had learned hard lessons about justice and its limitations. But first, before sleep, he'd read another letter to the territorial governor, recommending that circuit judges be given more resources, that background checks on law enforcement be made more thorough, that systems be strengthened to prevent another Marcus Flynn from slipping through. Small changes. Inadequate, probably, but better than doing nothing. Better than accepting that evil would always triumph, because good men couldn't be bothered to try harder. Outside his window, snow continued falling, clean and white and temporary, covering the scars but not healing them, hiding the ugliness but not erasing it. By morning, the town would be buried under a fresh layer of white, and children would wake to a world that looked new and innocent. But Bridger knew better. Under that snow, the ground remained what it had always been, hard, cold, unforgiving. Beautiful lies couldn't change ugly truths. He just had to make sure people remembered which was which. Spring came to Salvation Point with reluctant warmth, melting snow revealing ground that looked raw and wounded beneath winter's covering. The mine reopened under new management, a consortium from Denver that promised better safety measures and fair wages, promises Bridger intended to monitor closely. Silas Cord was 6 months into his sentence, reports from territorial prison suggesting he was a model inmate, quiet, cooperative, spending his time teaching other prisoners to read. Redemption, perhaps, or simply the exhaustion of a man who'd lost everything and found relief in that loss. Life had returned to normal, or what passed for normal in a town that had discovered its foundations were built on lies and blood. The widows had formed a mutual aid society, pooling resources and supporting each other through grief's long aftermath. Old man Chin had opened a small school in his granddaughter's memory, teaching immigrant children English and mathematics. The community was healing slowly, in the way humans did, absorbing trauma and carrying on because there was no alternative. Bridger stood in the cemetery on the anniversary of the mine collapse, March 15th, 1 year since 37 men died, and watched as families gathered to honor their dead. Father Domingo led prayers, his voice carrying across the hillside, and children placed wildflowers on graves that were slowly becoming part of the landscape. "Sheriff," the voice came from behind him, familiar despite only having heard it once before. Bridger turned slowly, his hand drifting toward his revolver out of habit, though he didn't draw. Thomas O'Brien stood at the cemetery entrance, looking thinner than Bridger remembered, but otherwise unchanged. He wore different clothes, simple worker's garb instead of trail-worn leather, and his face was clean-shaven, the scar more visible in daylight. But those winter-gray eyes remained the same, carrying weight that no amount of time would lighten. "Mr. O'Brien," Bridger acknowledged, his voice neutral. "I told you not to come back to Salvation Point." "I know, but I had to see." Thomas gestured toward the graves, where Flynn's wooden cross stood apart from the others. "I had to make sure he was really dead." "He's dead," Bridger confirmed. "Buried at Dead Man's Canyon like I told you. This is just a memorial marker, a reminder of what he did." Thomas moved closer, stopping beside Bridger, both men looking down at the cemetery below. "Do they hate me?" he asked quietly. "The families, do they know what I did?" "They know someone delivered justice when the law couldn't," Bridger said carefully. "I didn't give them your name. Seemed kin to that way. Let you be anonymous. Let them direct their feelings toward Flynn rather than toward his executioner." "Thank you." They stood in silence, watching families grieve and remember and slowly begin to pack up flowers and blankets, preparing to return to town and the lives they'd rebuilt from tragedy's ruins. The scene below was peaceful, almost pastoral, nothing to suggest the violence and betrayal that had brought them all to this hillside. "I came to see my brother's grave," Thomas said, his voice rough with emotion barely contained. "They buried him here, next to his parents," Bridger confirmed. "Father Domingo said a proper mass. The whole town attended. Your brother was a victim, and we treated him as such." Thomas's throat worked, Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed back grief that time hadn't erased. "Can you take me to it?" Bridger hesitated. He'd promised to arrest Thomas if he ever returned, but that promise felt hollow now, made in anger and confusion. The man beside him wasn't a criminal, or if he was the kind of criminal the frontier created and sometimes needed. "This way," Bridger said finally, leading Thomas down a different path that avoided the gathered families. Timothy O'Brien's grave was on the eastern slope, marked with a simple headstone that read, "Timothy O'Brien, age 14, truth teller, remembered." Someone, Bridger didn't know who, had planted wildflowers around the base, and they were just beginning to bloom, purple and yellow against the gray stone. Thomas dropped to his knees beside the grave, his hands touching the stone, with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the violence Bridger knew those hands had dealt. For a long moment, he said nothing, just knelt there, breathing hard, shoulders shaking with suppressed sobs. "I'm sorry, Timmy," he finally whispered. "I'm so sorry I couldn't protect you. But I made it right. I made sure he paid for what he did to you." Bridger stood back, giving Thomas privacy for grief that was both fresh and a year old. He understood that duality, the way loss could feel immediate even years later, how certain triggers could collapse time and make the pain feel brand new. Eventually Thomas composed himself, standing and brushing dirt from his knees. "Thank you for taking care of him, Sheriff, for making sure he wasn't forgotten." "He won't be," Bridger promised. "This town remembers its victims." They walked back toward the cemetery entrance, moving slowly, neither eager to end this strange reunion. At the gate, Thomas paused, looking back at Salvation Point spread out below. The buildings, the mine, the church steeple rising against blue sky. "Is it better now?" he asked. "The town, are they healing?" "They're trying," Bridger said. "Healing's not linear. Some days are better than others." But the truth helped. Knowing it wasn't negligence, but murder gave them something concrete to hate, and Flynn's confession gave them closure. "You're doing, even if they don't know it." "Will you tell them?" "Someday." Bridger considered this. "Maybe. When enough time has passed that emotion doesn't cloud judgment. When they can see you as a man who loved his brother and delivered justice, rather than as a vigilante who executed a prisoner." "Fair enough." Thomas extended his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Bridger shook it. "I'm leaving the territory, Sheriff. Heading west to California. Thought I'd try to start over, build something that isn't soaked in blood." "I hope you find that," Bridger said, and meant it. "But O'Brien, the man you killed, even if he deserved it, that stays with you. That's a weight you'll carry forever." "I know." Thomas's smile was sad, tired, the expression of someone who'd learned lessons too hard and too late. "But it's a weight I chose, and I'd choose it again if the same situation arose. Flynn needed to die, and the law wasn't going to make it happen." "Probably not," Bridger admitted, "but that doesn't make it right." "No," Thomas agreed. "Just necessary. There's a difference." He turned to leave, then paused once more. "That money, the insurance payout, did it help the families?" "It did. Not enough to replace what they lost, but enough to keep them fed and housed. Enough to matter." "Good." Thomas touched the brim of his hat in farewell, a gesture of respect that felt oddly formal given everything that had passed between them. "Take care of this town, Sheriff. It's worth saving." "I will." Then Thomas O'Brien walked away, descending the hill toward wherever his horse waited, leaving Salvation Point for the second and final time. Bridger watched until he disappeared beyond the rise, a solitary figure heading west toward sunlight and whatever redemption might be found there. Below, the memorial service was ending, families departing in small groups, heading back toward town and the endless work of living. Bridger descended the hill, greeting people as he passed, accepting their nods and words of thanks for the work he'd done uncovering truth and delivering justice. But as he walked, he thought about Thomas O'Brien's question, "Is it better now?" The answer was complicated. The town had its truth, Flynn's guilt, Cord's partial innocence, the knowledge that 38 deaths were murder rather than accident. That truth provided closure, allowed proper grieving, redirected anger toward appropriate targets. But truth had also revealed how easily systems failed, how vulnerable communities were to corruption from within, how justice sometimes required stepping outside the law to be delivered. Those revelations had shaken Salvation Point's foundations, replacing comfortable certainties with uncomfortable ambiguities. Better? Maybe. Different? Absolutely. More honest? Without question. Bridger reached his office as afternoon faded toward evening. Inside, paperwork awaited, the endless bureaucracy of law enforcement that continued regardless of philosophical crises or moral ambiguities. He hung his hat, settled at his desk, and began working through reports that documented the mundane realities of frontier justice. But periodically he paused, looking out the window toward the mountains where Thomas O'Brien had disappeared. Somewhere out there, a man who delivered justice outside the law was trying to build a life beyond violence. Somewhere closer, Silas Cord was serving time for crimes he'd actually committed, finally facing consequences for his exploitation and greed. And here in Salvation Point, a community was slowly healing from wounds that had cut deeper than they'd realized, learning that justice was complicated, that truth sometimes hurt more than lies, and that healing required acknowledging failures rather than hiding them. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. And in a frontier town built on copper and dreams and the occasional necessary lie, honesty was its own kind of redemption. Bridger returned to his paperwork, the scratch of his pen filling the quiet office, documenting truth for future generations who would need to know that their town had faced its darkness and emerged scarred but surviving. Outside, the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of copper and gold, colors that reminded him of the mine that had started everything, the deaths that had demanded justice, and the complex path between law and vengeance that he'd walked to find truth. The badge on his chest caught the fading light, and Bridger touched it briefly, feeling its weight and promise. 30 years he'd worn the star, 30 years of believing in law and order and civilization's thin veneer over barbarism. That belief had been tested, strained, nearly broken, but it remained, battered and modified, adapted to account for realities that his younger self hadn't understood. Justice was complicated. Truth was painful. Law was imperfect. But all three were necessary, and the work of maintaining them never ended. He would continue that work until he couldn't anymore. Not because it was easy or perfect or even always effective, but because someone had to try. Someone had to stand between civilization and chaos, holding the line even when that line wavered and threatened to break. "Tomorrow," he said to the empty office, a promise and a commitment. "Tomorrow I'll do better." And tomorrow would come, bringing new challenges, new failures, new opportunities to get justice a little bit closer to right. That was all anyone could do, and sometimes it was enough. See you around, my friend. I've got another story for you.